Good day, everyone. You're welcome to my YouTube channel, Everything Medical. In today's video, we shall be appreciating the heart, right? So, I have made video on the development of the heart, part 1 and part 2. So, this is part 3. So, if you are coming across to my channel at the first time, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and also share our video so that other students will benefit from it and also get a detailed class. Let's proceed. Now, these are the diagrams that we shall be using to appreciate one of those developmental events that led to the formation of the adult heart. Right? Now, number one thing we will discuss is the formation of the IV septum, that is the interventricular septum, the septum that partitions the two ventricles, that is the lower chamber of the heart, which is the right and left ventricle. The next one is the formation of the oticopulmonary septum, right? That spiral septum that partitions the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The next one is the formation of the heart valves. But among the heart valves, we shall only be discussing the ventricular valves, right? That is the atrioventricular valve, where we have the Zaskubi valve and the mitral or the Baskubi valve, right? Stick to the end so that you understand this embryonic molecular event, right? Now, this diagram that is arranged vertically here depicts the stages of the formation of the IV septum, that is the interventricular septum, right? This one that is arranged horizontally is telling us the developmental stages of the oticopulmonary septum, that is the spiral septum. Here is the partitioning of the truncus arteriosus and the bulbus cordis, followed by the migration of the neural crest cells from the truncal and bulbar ridge, right? Now, this one here is telling us the architectural developmental relationship of the oticopulmonary septum in a spiral fashion. Here is the relationship between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta as they're waned or being partitioned by the spiral septum, right? On its upper part, lower, middle part, and the lower part. This diagram here is the normal anatomical relationship of the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Now, these two diagrams here is the developmental stages of the atrioventricular valves, right? Those valves that is found or guide the AV canals, the AV canals, which can be called atrioventricular canals. These are the valves, the diagram depicting the valves which I'll be discussing. That is the valvular cups or the flaps of cups. This is the Transcubic valve because it has 3 valvular cups, while this is the Bascubic valve or the mitral valve because it has what? 2 valvular cups. Now let's proceed. Number one thing which I'll be discussing is the formation of the IV septum, right? Number one is formation of IV septum. That is the intraventricular septum. You have to understand that the IV septum is divided into 3 parts. Number one is the muscular part. Number 2 is the bulbar part. While number 3 is the membranous part. membranous part. However, these three parts of IV septum have different or unique developmental origin. They have different or unique developmental source, right? Now, we shall start from the muscular part. The muscular part of the IV septum developed from the floor of the primitive ventricle. Developed from the floor of the primitive ventricle, right? Now, watch. Here is the muscular part of the IV septum. Muscular part of IV septum. IV simply means intraventricular septum, right? Now, the muscular part of the IV septum developed from the floor of the primitive ventricle. This is the primitive ventricle. Here is the floor. Is the floor, right? So we have the primitive ventricle. That is the developing ventricle. Primitive ventricle. This is the atrium. This is the truncus arteriosus. Truncus arteriosus. This also remains the atrium. Now, how does the muscular part of the IV septum evolve? There is a median muscular ridge that begins to grow up. It begins to grow up upward from the floor of the primitive ventricle. That is the first event that took place that led to the formation of the muscular part of the IV septum, because there is usually a median muscular ridge that begins to grow up from the floor of the primitive ventricle nearer to the apex of the primitive ventricle, right? So that is how the muscular part of the IV septum began to evolve, right? However, this muscular part of the IV septum forms the major muscular mass of the IV septum, right? It forms the major muscular mass of the IV septum, right? And it's usually present in a diagonal pattern, right? It's usually present in a diagonal pattern. You can see it is present in a diagonal pattern. It is not horizontal nor vertical. Look at the line here that partition it from other part of the IV septum. It's usually present in a diagonal pattern. And the upper margin is concave. You can see it's concave or depressed. The upper margin is concave or depressed, right? You can see it is concave or depressed. Why? It is diagonal. It is not vertical nor transverse or horizontal. So that is all about the muscular part of the IV septum, right? Now, the next we shall be going into is the bulbar part. The bulbar part of the IV septum develops from the right and left bulbar ridge, right? Develop from the right and left bulbar ridge. Now, here is the right and left bulbar ridge. Right and left bulbar ridge, right? This is the fused AV cushion. Fused atrioventricular cushion. Now, how does the bulbar part of the IV septum evolve? There is a conical part on the ventricular chambers of the right and left bulbar ridge, right? So it usually grow from the distal part of the bulbus cordis, of the bulbus cordis. Bulbus cordis, right? Now, as it evolved from the distal part of the bulbus cordis, next event will take place, which is what? There will be a fusion there will be a fusion of the right and left bulbar ridge. They will fuse together to form the bulbar part of the IV septum, right? And when they fuses, look at the point of the fusion that creates a mature bulbar part of the IV septum. Bulbar part of IV septum, right? Now, look at it here also. Bulbar part of IV septum. However, the lower end or the lower margin of the bulbar part of the IV septum, look at it here, look at it here. This lower margin and also the upper margin of the muscular part of the IV septum create a space called the IV foramen. Look at the IV foramen here. IV foramen, which later being covered or closed by the membranous part of the IV septum. So that is all about the bulbar part of the IV septum. Let's quickly go to the next outline, which is the membranous part. Now, the membranous part of the IV septum developed from under. It developed as under. Now, what I will explain, it developed as under, right? Because the lower margin or the lower end of the bulbar part of the IV septum, also the upper part or the upper margin of the muscular part of the IV septum has or contains a proliferating tissues, right? And these tissues is mainly from the right part of the AV cushion and also the right and left bulbar part of the IV septum, right? So that is what that forms it. However, the membranous part of the IV septum comes from three sources or three developmental sources, such as which include the right AV cushion, which is this, the right AV cushion, and also the right and left bulbar part of the IV septum. That means it has three sources, which is the membranous part. First is the right AV cushion, while second is the left bulbar part, third is the right bulbar part of the IV septum. So that is how it works. And also, as the membranous part of the IV septum is trying to get informed or trying to be formed, right? It closes or makes the IV foramen to get diminished. You can see it has covered the IV foramen. It has covered the IV foramen. You can see it here. So here remains the membranous part of IV septum, right? So that is how it works, right? So we are done from the formation of the IV septum. But you have to understand that there's what we call ventricular septal defect. It is the most commonest congenital anomaly of the heart, which is usually formed mainly from the membranous part of the IV septum, right? So it occurs as a result of the fusion of the right and left bulbar part of the IV septum with the right AV cushion. That is what that causes ventricular septal defects. Ventricular septal defects. Ventricular septal defects, right? It is mainly being caused as a result of the failure of the fusion of the right and left bulbar part of the IV septum with the right AV cushion, which is this AV cushion. So that is how it works. We also have other anomalies that is associated with it, such as the Fallot tetralogy. The Fallot tetralogy. Fallot tetralogy is a combination of 4 congenital anomaly of the heart, and it is the most commonest congenital anomaly of the cyanosis of the heart. Cyanosis of the heart, right? So this is the most commonest. We have the number one is pulmonary stenosis. Number two is overriding aorta. Number three is majorly being formed by the hypertrophy of the right ventricle. That is one of those anomalies of the heart that constitute the fallot tetralogy, right? We also have another one, right? Let me list it here. Number one here is pulmonary stenosis. Number two is overriding aorta. Number three is hypertrophy of right ventricle. Number four is ventricular septal defect, which is IV septum defect. IV septum defect. So this constitutes the fallot tetralogy or tetralogy of fallot, right? It is the most commonest congenital cyanosis heart disease, right? So that is how it works. The next outline we shall be discussing is the formation of the aorticopulmonary septum or the spiral septum of the heart, right? So let's move on. We have number two outline, which is formation of aorticopulmonary septum. This septum is so much important because if this septum is deficient, there will be transposition of the great vessel, right? Whereby the aorta arises from the right ventricle, while the pulmonary trunk will arise from the left ventricle. You can see that is a complication altogether, right? It's a complication, and there will also be abnormal communication of the, or there will be communication of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, right? So this septum is so much important, right? Now let's proceed. This aorticopulmonary septum can be called the spiral septum because of how it's fashioned. Look at it here. So here is our aorticopulmonary septum, which can be called the spiral septum. Spiral septum. The spiral septum divides the truncus arteriosus into aorta and pulmonary trunk. So here is our pulmonary trunk. While this is our aorta, right? Now, it's usually develop, that is, the spiral septum develop from the two truncus ridge. Truncal ridge, right? Two truncal ridge. They evolve from two truncal ridge. The two truncal ridge which evolve the spiral septum usually develop due to the proliferation of the mesenchymal cells derived from the neural crest cells, which migrate from the truncus arteriosus, right? Now watch. This is the bulbous codice, or the bulbous ridge per se. So this is the bulbar ridge. Why this is the truncal ridge, right? So this two is called the bulbar ridge. Why this two is called the truncal ridge, right? So this is the neural crest cells, right? Because the two truncal ridge usually develop as a result of the proliferation of the mesenchymal cells derived from the neural crest cells as they migrate in the truncus arteriosus, right? That is why I say that the spiral septum divide or partition the truncus arteriosus into aorta and the pulmonary trunk, right? So this is the neural crest cell. This is neural crest cell. This cell. I will get a wider board, yeah, so that it will contain our structures. Now, you can see that we have formed or we have given a platform on how the truncal ridge evolve, right? Now, the two truncal ridge will come together, they will fuse together to form the spiral septum, right? To form the spiral septum. By the formation of the spiral septum will now partition the truncus arteriosus, right? In order to form the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Because what that separates these two blood vessels now is the spiral septum, which was formed by the two truncal ridge. Because the two truncal ridge fuses together to form them, which will partition the truncus arteriosus to form the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That is the essence. That is the essence, right? Now, as the spiral septum is partitioning the truncus arteriosus to form the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, there is a relationship between those blood vessels, right? On the upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. So we have the upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. What are the relation of the blood vessels, that is the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, in respect to the aorticopulmonary septum? So this is our aorticopulmonary septum, APS, aorticopulmonary septum. Now, on the upper part, look at it here. Look at this, 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 look at this. On the middle part, look at this, look at this, and look at this, right? I believe you're understanding it. While on the lower part, we have the aorta, we have the spiral septum. On the middle, we also have the pulmonary trunk here. So that is how they are being fashioned, because as the spiral septum is dividing them, they have their own relationship on the upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. Now, what are the relationship of these blood vessels in respect to the spiral septum? On the upper part, you can see that the pulmonary trunk is usually found anterior, while the aorta is found posterior, right? So this remains our pulmonary trunk. This pulmonary trunk, this is aorta. So this is pulmonary trunk. This is what? Aorta. So that means the pulmonary trunk is found anterior, while the aorta is found posterior. Now, recall that the spiral septum on its upper part usually lie corona. It is in coronal plane. It's in coronal plane, right? While on the middle, the spiral septum is sagittal in plane. That means the aorta and the pulmonary trunk are in parallel line with each other, whereby the aorta is found on the left, on the right, while the pulmonary trunk is found on the left. So this remains our aorta, while this remains our pulmonary trunk. This is our aorticopulmonary septum. On the lower part, you can see that the spiral septum is still lying on the coronal plane, like the same thing that happened on the upper part, but there is a change in position of the two blood vessels. So the aorta is found anterior while the pulmonary trunk is found posterior. This remains our pulmonary septum. So that is how it works, right? You can see it here. Now, there are developmental anomalies that are associated with the formation of the spiral septum or the pulmonary septum. Number one is when there is a non-spiral formation or development of the spiral septum. When this thing is not spiral, you can see it's spiral. It's like this. It's on this format. So it's not straight, right? So if it's not spiral this way, that means this pulmonary trunk will not arise from the right ventricle. It will go and arise on the left ventricle, while the aorta will not arise from the left ventricle. It will go and rise on the right ventricle, which is a problem. So the spiral septum has to appear spiral. That is why it's called the spiral septum. Had it been is not spiral, its name wouldn't have been called spiral septum alternatively, right? So it is because of the nature, spiral nature, that it is called a spiral septum. If not, it would have been called only the pulmonary septum. So it has to appear spiral so that there will not be abnormal connection on the both ventricles of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, right? However, there are also another clinical conditions such as defect of the spiral septum. If there's a defect of the spiral septum, there will be communication between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, maybe a kind of fistula, but it's not good. It is a congenital anomaly. So those are the clinical conditions that is associated with the formation of the spiral septum. So we have on that aspect, we have one is transposition of the blood vessel. Transposition of blood vessel. We also have number two, which is mainly by the defect of the spiral septum. Defect of spiral septum. So those are the clinical conditions that is associated with the formation of the spiral septum, right? So let's go to next one, which is the formation of the heart valves. Formation of heart valves. Formation of heart valves. On these heart valves, we have four heart valves, right? Four. We have the atrioventricular valves, which is the bicuspid and tricuspid valve. We also have the pulmonary valve and also the aortic valve. In this video, we shall only discuss those atrioventricular valve. In my next video, which is the part 4 video, I'm going to discuss the formation of the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, and also the formation of the conducting system of the heart and also the pericardium. So stay tuned. Now, we have the atrioventricular valves, where we have the right atrioventricular valve and left atrioventricular valve, right? Now, this is the diagram we shall be using. As you can see, the right atrioventricular valve can be called the tricuspid valve because it have 3 coops. It have 3 valvular coops, right? It is usually present between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So right atrium and right ventricle, right? And it is found to guide the AV canal, that is the atrioventricular canal. So this is the AV canal. Two of them are called the AV canal, this canal here, because those valves guide the AV canal. AV canal. Why this? This is the dense mesenchymal swellings. Dense mesenchymal swellings, which is formed by the proliferation of the subendocardial mesenchymal cells, right? So that is how it works. This is right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Now, how does the transcriptive valve evolve, which is the right atrioventricular valve, right? The subendocardial mesenchymal cells usually proliferate. As it proliferates, it forms three swellings. It forms what? Three swellings, right? And that three swelling we project into the AV canal. It will project into the AV canal to form a lumen. To form a lumen. The three swellings that was formed as a result of the proliferation of the subendocardial mesenchymal cells project into the AV canals, right, to form a lumen. But the funny thing is that the lumen it forms is not just a fused lumen. It's not just a fused lumen. Though that lumen has partition, which is what we call those valvular coops, right? Now, when bloodstream begin to flow in the heart, maybe from the right atrium to the right ventricle, the mesenchymal tissue that forms that lumen will degenerate and be replaced by a connective tissue, so that the coops will become strong and be able to work effectively by the muscular actions of the papillary muscles that is found on the wall of the ventricle, right? Now watch. These are the AV coops. AV coops, right? That or the valvular coops per se. All of them are called the valvular coops, right? Now, when the valves are there, because it has three valves, those swelling that was formed as a result of the proliferation of the subendocardial mesenchymal cells will later form a coops. They will become hollow to form a coops, right? Now, the free margins or the free end of those three coops of the transcriptive valve, because I'm discussing transcriptive valve, the three coops, which is anterior, posterior, and septal coops, right? Its free margin has usually been attached by the caudal tendinae to the papillary muscle. That is why they relax and contract, right? They contract, they kind of dilate and relax. They dilate and relax, right? So that blood will move from the right atrium to the right ventricle. So this valve, look, is usually here like this. This valve is here, right? This one is here. So these are those three swellings that was later being formed to be a coops, three valvular coops. So we have anterior, posterior, and septa, which can also be called the lateral, right? So you can see the muscle, this papillary muscle. These papillary muscles are usually found at the wall of the ventricle. Papillary muscles, which connects or which get connected to the rim of the valvular coops by the strings of the heart, which is called the chorda tendineae. The chorda tendineae. The chorda tendineae. This chorda tendineae usually connect these muscles to the rim of these valvular coops so that it will regulate the closing and opening of the AV canals when blood is coming from the right atrium to the right ventricle. That is how it works. Now, recall that why this valve is called the tricuspid valve is because it has what? 3 valvular coops, right? Look at it here, 1, 2, 3. That is why it's called the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid. Now let's quickly look at the next valve under this atrioventricular valve, where we have the mitral valve or the left atrioventricular valve, right? Now, it has the same origin. It has the same origin with the tricuspid valve, right? So the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve is a valve that is present between the left atrium and the left ventricle. It guides the left AV canal. The left AV canal. This is left AV canal. This is right AV canal. The right AV canal is usually being guided by the by the tricuspid valve. Why the left AV canal is guided by the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, right? Bear it in mind. Now, how do they develop? Right? They have been developed as a result of the proliferation of the sub endocardial mesenchymal cells, thereby creating two swellings only. That is why it's called the bicuspid valve. It is as a result of the proliferation of the sub endocardial cells, sub endocardial mesenchymal cells, that led to the formation of the two swelling, which is called the anterior and posterior swellings. As the formation proceeds or goes, those two swellings will later become the anterior and posterior valvular coops, right? So look at the two coops here. Look at anterior, look at posterior, right? So this is our mitral valve. Mitral valve, and here is our tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve. So that is how it works. So we only have anterior and posterior swellings here. That is the two coops. While for here we have 3 coops: anterior, posterior, and septa or lateral. So that is how it works. So recall that why this bicuspid valve can be called a mitral valve is that it has the same resemblance with bishop mitre. I believe if you are a Roman Catholic or a Anglican, if you see the bishop mitre, that cap we normally wear, so it resembles like this valve. So that is why it can be called the mitral valve. Mitra. So that is how the name came to be. So this remains our left atrium and left ventricle. I believe we have done justice to the formation of the IV septum, the formation of the spiral septum, and also the formation of the heart valves under AV valves. In my next video, that is the development of the heart part 4, I'm going to treat the formation of the pulmonary and aortic valves, and also the development of the conductive system of the heart, followed by the formation of the pericardium. Then I'm done with video on the development of the heart. Go and watch my video on part 1 and part 2. Thanks so much for staying to the end. I really appreciate it.